You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got one of the biggest developments thus far in Trump's prosecutions. We've now witnessed two major flips in the Fulton County, Georgia trial. Both Sidney Powell and Kenneth Chesebro, those were the recent ones. Of course, there was also Scott Hall a few days back. But what does this mean for Trump?
Brian, these two flips by these Trump associated lawyers may prove to be the final nail in Trump's legal coffin. Here's why. These two lawyers were big ticket players in Trump's criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election, and not just down in Georgia, where they just pleaded guilty. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a few minutes. But let's start with Kenneth Chesebro. He is the architect of the fake elector scheme. He was basically drafting out the blueprint for Donald Trump's corrupt scheme, and he was helping implement it. Sidney Powell, that's even more ominous for Donald Trump, because yes, we all saw her on TV spewing out all of these absurd lies about non-existent election fraud. But here is where she will prove to be most damaging to Trump. She was in the Oval Office meeting, or meetings, plural, when they were hatching this corrupt scheme to try to steal the presidency. And if you'll recall, at one point it got so bad and so absurd and so criminal what they were planning that somebody drafted a presidential order where Trump was directing the military to seize voting equipment from battleground states. There's a word for that in the law. It's called theft. It also probably violates a whole bunch of other federal laws. You can't use the military, courtesy of the Posse Comitatus Act, to engage in civilian law enforcement activity. Setting all that aside, not only did somebody draft this presidential order, but the presidential order named Sidney Powell as special counsel for, in essence, the Stop the Steal scheme to overturn the results of the presidential election. She was in the room. She can actually testify to that jury down in Georgia, where she pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate and testify truthfully against all of her co-defendants, including Donald Trump. She can tell the jurors exactly what was going on in the Oval Office. That is going to be directly and sharply incriminating evidence against Donald Trump, in my opinion, and probably a whole bunch of other co-conspirators, criminal associates.
Well, to that point, when we see that Sidney Powell is cooperating, given who she is, how can prosecutors trust that her cooperation is actually valid? Like, doesn't her very well-known lunacy kind of detract from her value as a cooperating witness?
Great question. So just because you plead guilty and you agree to testify against others, there's no guarantee that you're the kind of witness a jury is going to believe. These are tactical considerations. Anytime a prosecutor is trying to decide whether to offer a defendant a plea with cooperation. Let me give you an easy example. Rudy Giuliani. As a prosecutor, would I ever want to put Rudy Giuliani on the stand and urge a jury to believe a word out of his mouth when you know his cross-examination would start with, "Mr. Giuliani, you were the one who famously said truth isn't truth"? Who's going to believe Rudy Giuliani? So he is the kind of defendant no prosecutor, relishes the prospect of bringing into the stable, putting on the stand, and presenting him to a jury, because you know what that does? It actually dirties up the prosecutors by implication when you're sponsoring such a cruddy and apparently incredible defendant as a cooperating witness. Now, going back to Sidney Powell, you're absolutely right, Brian. We saw her go on air and make all these outrageous claims of non-existent election fraud. Those were lies. So how do you put her on the stand and urge a jury to believe her? Two ways. One, corroboration. I have taught classes on how to deal with cooperating witnesses, and the three most important words are corroboration, corroboration, and corroboration. You have to get every scrap of evidence and information that supports the truthfulness of what Sidney Powell will tell those juries once she's testifying at the trial of others down in Georgia. That will be her emails, her text messages, her written notes. It will also be the statements of others who heard what Donald Trump said and did, what Rudy Giuliani said and did, what Mark Meadows said and did, because you can corroborate one witness with the testimony of another witness. But most importantly, we like to use what we kind of in offhanded fashion refer to as hard corroboration. And that is things that are in writing, that are indisputable and irrefutable. So they're going to be scouring all of Sidney Powell's computers and cell phone, her files. She has now pledged to cooperate and give them all over to the prosecutors down in Georgia as part of her plea agreement. So they're going to have to corroborate her. And once they do, Brian, here is how the argument will go before the jury. Ms. Powell, you lied and lied and lied and lied to the public over the public airwaves about non-existent election fraud. Isn't that true? Yes, I did. Why? Because I was lying for Donald Trump at his request to try to help him unlawfully retain the presidency. What you've done is you converted her lies into incriminating evidence that implicates Donald Trump, because that is for whom she was telling those lies. So I know that feels like a law school class, because there's a lot to unpack with a witness like Sidney Powell. But, I've danced that dance many times with cooperating witnesses, and this is how I expect it to play out.
Okay, no, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Glenn, we are 3 for 3 right now on flips between Scott Hall, Kenneth Chesebro, and Sidney Powell. Do you think there's any likelihood that all of the co-defendants in Fulton County flip on Trump? Because right now, Fani Willis is batting 100% in terms of flipping defendants ahead of their immediate trials, at least.
Yeah, I do. I think there's a very good chance that most, or perhaps all, of the ultimately 19 co-defendants will end up pleading guilty. So first of all, remember, you still have that whole lower tier of fake electors, right? They weren't the kind of players, they weren't the kind of big ticket sort of, doing big ticket damage to our nation the way Trump, Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, John Eastman, Jeffrey Clark, the corrupt DOJ official, and some of the others were doing. So I have a feeling you're going to see these low-level defendants begin to plead out, perhaps some to sentences of probation, which is what Powell and Chesebro were offered and accepted. And we can talk about some of the challenges that poses. But I think you're going to see most, and maybe even all, defendants, perhaps with the exception of Donald Trump himself, end up pleading guilty, because, the writing's on the wall. DA Willis has been really strategic in the people she has opted to try to flip first. She got that bail bondsman, Scott, what was his name? Scott Hall, because she knew that Scott Hall was basically in league with Sidney Powell in their breach of the Coffee County voting equipment. So Scott Hall flipped, which helped her flip Sidney Powell, which helped her flip Kenneth Chesebro. And it's really a vindication. This is a vindication of the tactical decisions that Fani Willis not only is making in who she's trying to flip, but in her tactical decision to bring a massive, sprawling 19 co-defendant RICO conspiracy case. Because, Brian, we just saw Kenneth Chesebro go into court and plead guilty to a felony conspiracy charge, proving that DA Willis had it right the whole time.
Well, to that point, will there come a point where prosecutors won't accept any more flips because they've already got what they need? And if so, would that really create a mad dash right now among the remaining co-defendants to go to Fani Willis's office to cooperate?
Yeah, another great question. So when I was involved in large RICO cases, and we would indict more than 24 people in one of the cases, there are times where you start pleading people out without cooperation. Why? Because you don't need them. So, for example, all of these bail bondsmen, the sort of lowest rung on the criminal ladder down in Georgia, Fani Willis might say, listen, we are so far past what you could have provided if you were a cooperating witness. We don't need you. So they start to make what are called non-cooperation plea offers, just to cull out some of the folks who are no longer important to what Fani Willis is trying to build. Now, the flip side of it is Fani Willis might say to people, look, we don't need you anymore. So we're not going to extend you any kind of plea offer. You're on your own. Here's the only thing that will be left for those defendants to do. They can take what we often refer to as a soldier plea. What that means is they can walk into court, they can plead guilty to every count in the indictment just to have it over if there are no plea offers being extended by the prosecutors. But then they are facing a ton of potential jail time if they end up pleading guilty to all counts, including the lead charge, which is the RICO conspiracy count, which carries a mandatory minimum of 5 years and up to 20 years in prison. So, Fani Willis seems to be holding all the cards, and it's just a question of how she wants to play those cards with respect to the remaining defendants.
Okay. Now, we were expecting this speedy trial to start on October 23rd and to last, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months, which means that the next batch of defendants wouldn't go to trial until like January or so. Now that there won't be a speedy trial, is it possible we could see the next batch go to trial immediately? And could that batch include Donald Trump himself?
Yeah, great questions. Not immediately, but certainly within the coming months, because once a judge sets a trial date, he or she has to set it far enough out to give the defense notice and an opportunity to kind of marshal their evidence, subpoena their witnesses, prepare to go to trial. That is at least a several month proposition. It could be 3 months, could be 4 months. We don't know. But I do think you're going to see the parties now kind of hauled into court down in Georgia, the remaining defendants, and Judge McAfee say, okay, time for us to set another trial date because the first trial date that we set has been resolved via guilty pleas. And, they will all be scrambling, all of the defendants, because what I can tell you is no defendant ever wants to go first. Every defendant in a co-defendant case, particularly in a conspiracy case, they want to go second, they want to go third, they want to go last, so they can sit there and preview all of the evidence in the earlier trial. So this will now be up to Judge McAfee. Who's going to go to trial next? How many of the co-defendants will go to trial next? How many will plead out? Will they be able to winnow it down so that there is only a need for one conspiracy trial? And if they get it down to 4, 5, 6 co-defendants, I think we will see one RICO trial down in Georgia with those remaining defendants who decided not to plead guilty. And, that could be set for some time, in the winter, maybe in the early spring. Of course, with Donald Trump as the marquee defendant, and with Donald Trump having a federal trial in D.C. scheduled to begin on March 4th, that will complicate matters as to whether Donald Trump can be in the next batch of defendants who ends up going to trial down in Georgia.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty damning indictment when you have to figure out when the next trial would be based on the schedule of all of the other prosecutions that he's contending with at the same time. So with that said, obviously a lot happening in this Fulton County case, and things are moving pretty quickly right now. So when we have any new updates, we'll bring them to you. If you want to follow along, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.